I think I know a lot of you folks. I'm the one that sort of roped Celia and Nathan into this. And I'm very glad that they volunteered to do this. I'm the non-expert. I would, if we were out in the field, I would be the one talking about the great property that unfortunately we can't visit today. But we will be able to see a number of the plants that we'd be seeing there. And I would encourage you all to visit the Burley Farm, take a walk. It's just a great piece of property. And SELT has so many great properties. So, and enjoy this great weather, even though it's very dry. It's a wonderful time to be out, and it's one of the few things we can enjoy safely these days. So please get out and enjoy them. Nathan?
Hey, I'm Nathan Rowe. I am currently a master's student at UNH, studying what drives mostly understory plant distribution in the White Mountains, things like topography and soil chemistry. Did my undergrad at UNH, and then I moved out west and worked for the Forest Service for a while doing botany jobs. And yeah, I came back here for a master's, and I've known Phil for quite a while. And so yeah, he asked me to help out with this, and I was really happy to be involved. So yeah.
Okay, let's go.
All right. Oops. All right. This is our very fancy field trip. So I guess we will start in the field. And we will go. All right.
This plant is called yellow rattle, and it's growing in abundance in the Burley fields in a couple different places. It's a hemiparasite, which means that it can make its own food. You can see it has green leaves, but it also is parasitic on the roots of other plants, primarily grasses. And this particular one is non-native in New Hampshire. There is a native subspecies of this plant that lives in the alpine zone. But this one is a non-native and is fairly widespread in lower elevations. And maybe, Zoe, we could go to the one-flowered cancer root. Yeah, that one. So this plant, just doing some similar plants together, is in the same family, the Orobanchaceae, and it is fully parasitic. You can see that the stems are white. There's no chlorophyll, so it's completely dependent on other plants for its nutrients. I've seen this one or two here and there, or in some fields, just clumps of it all over the place. So it all depends on the conditions at the time.
Let me just interject a couple things here. Well, first of all, this is in part of the field area on the Burley property that we're managing for early successional habitats. We want to keep it in this sort of old field condition. So it gets mowed once a year. When we purchased the property, it had grown into woody plants and was very rapidly proceeding to be forest. And there are, as you know, there is lots of forest cover in the state, but what we've chosen to do as a management plan to this part of the property, and we do similar things on other sections of other properties, is keep it in that early successional habitat, which is very rare in the state. It's quite rare. And many of the plants that we're focusing on first here are found there, and they've come really blossomed since we started this annual mowing regime on these properties.
I think the next plant we might go to is the wood betony, which is another hemiparasite. That one, yes. So this one is on the watch list in New Hampshire, which means that it's not threatened or endangered, but it's uncommon. The people at the Natural Heritage Bureau haven't quite determined what its status is in the state. But you can see it has these red, purpley red fern-like leaves, and then it has a cluster of radiating petals. In some cases, they're yellow with purple, or they may tend toward more purple. Sometimes there's green mixed in with the flowers. But when you come across this plant in abundance in a field, when it's in bloom, you can just see the flowers standing out above the usually lower grasses at that point in the year. It's mid-May kind of flowering time. But again, this is another hemiparasite and primarily uses grass roots to get its nutrients.
So Nancy Fisk is asking what time of year we mow. When does it usually get mowed?
So I think it's key that whenever you're trying to manage for these, what we typically do is mow once, and we mow really late in the year, as late as we possibly can. And that allows all the flowering plants that are primarily herbaceous to go through their life cycle, but it also allows the insects, a number of them that are quite late and that might migrate, to take advantage of these plants. So really late in the year, as late as we can get it done.
And then also for everyone watching, I know it's small, but up here in the corner, it'll say the name of the plant, but I'm happy to reiterate. So this is wood Betany. And then the Mira is asking, oh, I'm glad you made it on, Mira. Mira is asking if it's possible to say what month all of these flowers are typically seen when we go through them.
Well,
And these are mostly in bloom right now, right? Is that correct?
all of the photos were taken kind of mid-May up until yesterday. So, so a few of them will no longer be in bloom if they were a mid-May flowering plant. Although sometimes the bloom time is spread out over a number of weeks. But if you can't find it in bloom, you will, like this one, you could recognize by the leaves, and also it will have set fruit by now. And so those will be in the same kind of whorl as the flower. And all of the photos were also, almost all of the photos were taken within, say, a 10 or 15 mile radius of the Burley farm. So like this one lives across the street from where I live in Nottingham, not too far from the Lee traffic circle.
All right. Who's up next?
Oh, there was a second yellow rattle picture that maybe you could just click on, and that's just a little different view of the same plant. You can see that inflated sac at the base of the flower, and that will become the fruit later in the season. But it's a quite distinctive characteristic of the plant. All right.
Okay.
Well, we can go to the wild lupine, which is one that was, it's up at the top, yeah. That one was not taken nearby, but it does exist in some sites not too far from where we are. But this is a state endangered plant, and it's being managed as part of the Carner blue butterfly habitat. So it looks very much like the the common horticultural lupin that you might see on the roadside, but this one's shorter and not as dense an inflorescence. But it's something you could keep your eye out for on kind of poor quality fields.
Yeah, usually very, very sandy sites. This plant is sort of restricted to that. And in the pine barrens where they're trying to manage for the Carner Blue, those are very deep, dry, sandy soils. And interesting, from what I understand about the butterfly, it can't take advantage of the cultivated lupins. It can only use this one.
Right.
So it won't go to those for any sustenance. So it doesn't do any good to plant that other one if you're trying to attract that endangered species.
All right. Well, I guess we can just go through the rest of the plants on the field folder. So the stitchwort would be the next one. A lot of the plants on the burley fields are introduced species. They're not native, but they're quite common, and so it's something that you might see in your walks. Oh, I see Ellen has a question about the seed sources for the native lupin. You could try the Xerxes Society, starting with an X. They might have it. I'm not sure on that, but lots of times you'll find something that says wild lupin, and it isn't really wild lupin. It's the cultivated variety. So the stitchwort, it looks like it has 10 petals, but it really only has 5 because each one of those is a pair of very deeply divided petals. And Nathan, you can correct me if I'm calling something a petal when it's really not.
Yeah, that sounds good.
But it's a fairly distinctive looking flower. Okay, next. Robin's plantain is, let's see, is that a native one? Yes, this one is native. It's a type of erigeron, a fleabane, and it typically blooms earlier in the season, kind of in the early part of June, the end of May, and it's often pink or blue in color, where most of the other erigerons are white. And this one has you can see it has a fairly broad leaf. Sometimes it's called the spring aster, but it's not really an aster. Okay, next. The Oxidase is another introduced plant, which is very common, and you'll see it in bloom on the roadside, in fields, in along people's driveways. And I guess it's probably everybody knows that one when they see it. Next. Oh, okay, the heal-all. This is a plant that was used by both Native Americans and their early settlers for a number of medicinal purposes. It's called heal-all or self-heal. And it has quite a long blooming time. So it starts blooming back in May, but you can see it in bloom later through the season as well. And it's common in both fields and somewhat shaded areas. right.
All right, so this is wild geranium, which grows in kind of variable habitats. You can find it growing in fields, but you also find it in forests, particularly if the forest canopy is maybe a little more open, and I see it in kind of more moist forest kind of soils, but it can be quite common. It was just flowering a couple weeks ago. I was seeing a ton of it. So it kind of flowers in spring, early summer. I'm in very seacoast, New Hampshire, and Newmarket. It's kind of on its way past. Definitely find it in fruit, but for some of you who might be a little bit further north, you may still be seeing it in flower. And so I think the next photo is a close-up of the flower. Yeah, so here's a close-up of the flower. It's an awesome flower, pretty showy. And in the woods where you don't always see a ton of flowers, when it is in the understory, it's quite cool. And so yeah, you see, I'll talk a little bit. I kind of am interested in plant evolution and plant families and stuff. So most of you probably know on the outside, the purple part here, these are the petals. And then on the very center, you see one kind of structure. That's the pistil, that's the female part of the flower there. And surrounding it are the stamens. There's several stamens there, 10 stamens. Those are the male parts. And so those can be really important for identifying plants. And so I'll talk about those a little bit more with some other plants.
Well, probably everyone knows this one, even though it's not quite in bloom in this photo. This is a common milkweed. And in case you didn't know, next week is National Pollinator Month, National Pollinator Week. So it's important to plant these as a host to the monarch butterfly. And again, you might try the Xerxes Society as a possible seed source, but you wouldn't have any trouble at all finding seeds for this just walking down the road or in your neighbor's field, and it will seed in from the seeds that you find, or you could try to transplant it. There are several different kinds of milkweeds that are native to New Hampshire, and I think most all of them are suitable for monarchs. Next.
Okay, so these are bluets, and so these will grow in fields and on forest edges. I've seen them kind of on the sides of lawns and things like that. They seem to flower kind of forever. They in the Wildflower book, which I'm not sure if people can see my video if they're just seeing what Zoe's sharing, but Wildflowers of New England's a really good guide, and Bluets are on the cover of that. So it's always cool to see plants that are on the cover of
Oh, it doesn't show up.
Yeah, and so these, you'll notice these have 4 petals, and that's most flowers, well, maybe not most, but it's very common to see flowers with 5 petals. And so when you see 4, that kind of gives you some good clues on something a little bit different is going on. And this is in the madder family, which isn't a terribly important family for this area, but when you see a flower with 4 petals, it's definitely something you want to kind of clue into. And it'll flower from spring to fall, so great opportunity to see this flowering. If you go out in the woods or out to Burley Farm, you're quite likely to see it.
I have a question about the milkweeds from Robin. Robin is asking, she says, I tried transplanting 5 milkweeds from a neighbor's lawn. The roots were lateral tap roots. I babied them, but none of them survived. Oh. So I'm not sure if there are better ways of transplanting, or perhaps it depends where one transplants. Do you guys have any?
I would say that your best bet is to to seed them rather than to transplant them. Or if you're going to transplant them, you need to dig one up that's very small so that you get most of the root. They do have tap roots, yes.
And let me add that many of the butterfly bush varieties that you can plant that are not, they are in the milkweed family, they will be predated by many of the butterflies that we're interested in as well. So if you're not successful with the native milkweeds, that's another thing to do. Start a butterfly garden with the cultivated varieties. And they're quite beautiful plants. There's a lot of different varieties.
Well, I saw a question there about the orange cultivar.
I didn't see it.
It says that they're susceptible to aphids.
Oh, I haven't had trouble with those in my garden, but there's a beetle that totally defoliated mine last year. But they do set seed readily, and you can just take the pods and sprinkle the seeds around wherever you'd like to grow some new ones. And if you lose them one year because they've been defoliated, you can grow some new ones.
Yeah, I think you find that milkweeds in general are predated by a wide variety of insects and have other disease problems. It's sort of the nature of the beast. They spread their seed very, abundantly and grow quickly. They're adapted to a variety of sites. So I wouldn't be too worried. One year you may have those aphids, the next you won't.
And Cam says that Prairie Moon Nursery has wild lupine seeds. So I'll send that link. I'll collect everything I'll send you all a list of resources when we get the recording and everything, so that you can do your homework and get all caught up. So, all right, I'll mute myself.
Oh, this is one of my favorite spring wildflowers. It's called, the common name is blue-eyed grass. It's not a grass, it's an iris. And if I were going to choose a color for its eyes, I'd say they were yellow. But this particular one is from a field on my neighbor's property. And there were just big clumps of them all along in this field. There are maybe 4 different species of this genus that live in New Hampshire, but this one's the most common one, I think, Syrinchium montanum. And sometimes you'll just find a single plant. If you look at the base of the plant, it kind of has that fan-shaped leaf arrangement the way an iris would. And you can transplant them from one little spot in your yard or your neighbor's field into your garden if you want. And they'll be quite happy there for a while anyway. All right. This one's a shrub, actually. It's a blackberry, and probably Rubus Allegheniensis. This particular one, if you're walking through a field when this is in bloom, it has the most wonderful fragrance. So that's another good way to identify it. It's in the rose family. You can see the similarity from the flowers to roses.
I was muted. Well, that concludes the field part of our walk today. So We'll pop back out here, and where would you folks, so we're about halfway through our time, and unfortunately we do have a hard stop time of just a couple minutes before 11, just because someone else at SELT needs our Zoom account. So the joys of virtual living. So we, but Phil has suggested that if we can't get through everything and if there's interest, we could hold another one of these, especially because the photos are all collected. So we can talk about that later, but just so nobody feels like they're getting ripped off. Everybody gets their money's worth on this. So where should we head next? We've done fields, and then we have wet meadows, wet woodlands, and bogs.
We don't have a lot of flowers in the bogs. Let's go look at them for a minute and then click over to woodlands right after that.
Good plan. All right.
All right, so this is small cranberry, which is related to blueberries. And so this is growing in a boggy area. And so it's in the blueberry family, the small cranberry species. And the blueberry family grows in kind of variable habitat. Sometimes you find them growing in kind of rocky conditions, kind of thin soils, but other times you'll find them in bog conditions. And the similarities is that they kind of grow in acidic conditions. So so this is small cranberry here. The flower is a little bit unique from some of the other blueberries that usually have fused petals kind of hanging down. It's pretty showy. It's quite cool. Yeah, so that's small cranberry. It's small and trailing, and so if you're in a bog-like area and it's not flowering, you really need to look kind of carefully down at your feet, and you'll find these really small leaves, maybe about the size of your pinky nail, kind of trailing, and a lot of times they're quite common in bog areas.
I'm going to ask a very basic question. Can you define a bog? Like, what's a bog versus a wetland, and what?
Yeah,
where might I find a bog?
Yeah, I can tackle this. Most of what we have that looks like a bog, particularly in southern New Hampshire, is actually a fen. And so we have bogs and fens. They're glacially, what happened is these were scalloped out areas where water gets trapped for a good part of the year. And plants that fall down into these decompose very slowly because of this wet environment. And usually they're dominated by sphagnum mosses. And very often when you go into a fen or a bog, you end up walking on a floating mat of the mosses. The difference between a fen and a bog is probably not that important. The bog is usually totally entrapped water. It can't escape, and it's very acidic, very nutrient poor, whereas a fen is just slightly more enriched, and water may be able to spill out of it and enter into it in a stream sort of fashion. Again, most of what we have around here are fens, but call them bogs for it's the more common term used.
Here's a book that you might be interested in if you're interested in bogs and fens. Bogs and Fens by Ronald Davis, and it has almost all of the plants that you're likely to find in a bog. If you want to go visit a bog, you want to probably go to one that has a boardwalk. The Philbrook Crescenti Bog in New London is one place that you can go visit that has quite an extensive boardwalk system.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. The note here is that these plants are sensitive, the sites are sensitive, and they're not friendly places to walk, thankfully, but these are not the kinds of places where lots of people should go in and visit haphazardly. You can really do some damage here. Okay, let's look at the cool plants though.
Well, this is one of the photos that is not from around here. This is from the Esquwa Bog in Vermont, over near the New Hampshire border. They have a boardwalk system, and this is the time of year when these showy lady slippers are in bloom. There are a few sites in New Hampshire where they live as well, but the Vermont habitat has a much more enriched, higher pH soil and water system. So you'll find a lot of plants in Vermont that you won't find in the acidic soils of New Hampshire. But if you Google Esquwa Bog, E-S-Q-U-A, I think it is, you can get directions. It's managed by the combination, I think, of the Native Plant Trust and maybe the Nature Conservancy. I'm not quite sure about the other managing partner. But there are lots of these showy lady slippers and a number of other orchids and bog plants.
Just another side note to that, to the mention of the site. Many of the locations of rare plants in New Hampshire, actually everywhere, but here particularly, are associated with where there's this unusual bedrock. And so you have nutrients that aren't typically available to plants showing up because you had a little bit different geology going on. These are limestone-based soils that attract a lot of different plants in Vermont compared to New Hampshire. We just don't have limestone bedrock except right along the Connecticut River Valley. But we do, particularly in the Seacoast region, we have these areas where there's unusual uplifts and a little bit different geology here and there, and we find some of the rarer plants associated with that. So site, if you get into plants or are into them, if you can sort of pick out where those sites are, you'll often bump into them.
Okay, so this is a carnivorous plant, and so it's a sundew, and so we talked about how pH has a big effect on plants, and so in these bog-like areas, generally quite acidic and can be really limited on nutrients, and so being a carnivorous plant that eats insects, so there are these sticky little surfaces on this that flies will get stuck to. And that's another source of nutrients for these plants. So they're kind of going outside of the normal mechanism of getting their nutrients from soils. And yeah, in bogs and fens, you'll see this. It's not always that common, but really cool to see carnivorous plants. So keep an eye out for that. This is quite small. This is, you can kind of see the grass around it, but maybe just a couple inches tall.
Yeah, this is one of those really interesting plants. It's got a ton of adaptations that I think are really cool. It has two different tentacles on it. We can see the long ones from here. And it turns out that scientists have discovered that they tend to call those snap tentacles. And they can basically flick an insect quickly into the stickier droplet covered shorter tentacles, which then can move the insect into the part of the plant that will then devour it. I'm glad these things aren't like 4 feet in diameter. But a pretty cool plant.
And so this is a pitcher plant. So you see up at the top the flower, which is really cool to see. This is the best flower on a pitcher plant that I've seen. It looks quite, I don't know too much about this family, but it looks like a really old kind of plant family characteristic to me. So really showy flower. And then down at the bottom, you'll see the pitcher that many of you are probably more familiar with. It's not totally in focus, but yeah, down at the bottom there, you'll see. And so another carnivorous plant where insects can enter into that pitcher. A lot of times there's some some kind of water in there, and they'll consume those insects and get the nutrients from them. Another adaptation to poor nutrient conditions in soils. Yeah, so that's a look at what a bog or a fen would look like. A lot of kind of short vegetation, and so you'd have some of the cranberries and the pitcher plants and sundews kind of all down in that matted area, and that's kind of peat that you're standing on. So if you kind of jumped or something like that, feel the whole surface kind of wiggling. It's all saturated with water. It could be up to 40 feet deep, something like that, of water and peat. And then this is bog laurel, so another ericaceous plant. So, not carnivorous here, but this is a family that's kind of adapted to some of these poor conditions with quite acidic soils and low availability to nutrients.
And Nancy Fisk just said there's a great song called "The Rattlin Bog." Maybe next time we do this, we'll have that playing when everyone joins in. It's our intro music.
Yeah, and this is Bog Arum, which I haven't actually seen this too many times, and the site that I found this in was not quite as bog-like as some of those other species that we're looking at. It's more kind of in a wet forested site, and I honestly can't tell you too much about the habitat of this species. Celia or Phil might be able to fill you in better.
Well, I think it likes very wet environments. That's where I've seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah, occasionally you do see it on the edges of the bogs where the sunlight starts really coming in there. Some people call it Kayla lily, but it's not really related to the Kayla lily, which I think of as being more tropical or Mediterranean. And I don't think the tropical ones are even related to the Mediterranean ones, if I'm right on that. But so this is a different, but it looks, the flower's quite similar in many ways.
Keep talking while I'm muted. So it looks like that's the end of the bogs. I'd say, do we want to try and do a couple more? Do we have any, or do we want to look at the participant flowers and see if we can guess those?
Yeah, let's do those.
Sure.
Okay, and then we can talk about, well, we'll be in touch, but I just don't want to run out of time. And I want to make sure that everyone has plenty of time for questions at the end if you've got stuff brewing or, so. All right, let's look at the participant flowers. And I don't know if, it's hard to see who's actually here. I know that Valerie, who sent some of these, was not able to come, and it looks like Lonnie might also not have been able to come, but nonetheless, they sent us their flowers, so let's check them out.
So I think these first two, you can just go back and forth between the two slides. There isn't a flower here, but my best guess is that it's a non-native orchid called helleborine, Epipactis. Helleborine is the scientific name. It's a little uncertain because we don't have the flowers to confirm the ID, but that would be what my guess is. You can see it's growing in a massive vinca, which would be a disturbed environment near somebody's home, perhaps. And that's what this plant does. If you're walking around in the forest or in somebody's yard, you're very likely to come across this orchid. It blooms a little later in the year. Zoe, did you get the link for the Go Botany website? Well, that's all right. We don't have to go there. But there's a plant a Native Plant Trust website called Go Botany that you can use to look up plants, and it'll have multiple pictures of the same species, and it'll tell you its range in New England, what counties it's in. It'll show you other plants that are similar and how to tell them apart. And usually there's a little information about how Native Americans would use it. You can check out that website for your own use. So that's my best guess with this limited information about what this plant is.
Orchids are pretty cool. I believe there's more species of orchid than any other plant family. I think it's estimated between 20 and 30,000 species, a lot of which are tropical, a lot of rare species. And you'll notice the leaves here, you can't see it too well, but there are veins on the leaves, and the veins are parallel rather than, so you'll see, yeah, kind of parallel veins, almost like a grass has parallel veins. And if you see the plant below it, actually, you can see how the veins there kind of cross or meet kind of at angles. And so when you see parallel veins on plants, that's a diagnostic feature. And when you see really showy, unique kind of flowers, like a lady slipper or something, you know, with kind of a spur or a sac or something like that, and parallel veins, it's a good indication that you're looking at an orchid.
I think probably a lot of people don't realize how many orchids there are in New Hampshire. Just in my property and my neighbor's property, I've found 10 different species of orchids. So some of them are rare and some of them are quite common. And if you're interested in orchids, there's a book for that too, that I could recommend. In answer to the question about non-natives, many non-natives are not invasive, and I don't think it's important to remove them. But there are certainly lots of invasive non-natives, and Burley Farm is a prime example of some of that. But I wouldn't go around and pull up the Epipactus. This one, I'm a little in question. It looks to me like some kind of an apple from the leaf and the flower. If you zoom out, it though kind of looks like it's on some rocky ball. So I'd be curious, I know we don't have this person participating, but if an apple would usually bloom mid-May, and I don't think there are any native trees that have a leaf like that and a flower that big except an apple. So that's my best guess without any more information about when and where this was taken. I saw a question at the bottom. Oh, a list of books. Good. Yeah.
Yes, I'm diligently taking notes of all the resources, and I'll compile a nice email and send it out to everyone when we're through, so you can all do your extra reading.
Well, this one we have some copies of in our woodland slideshow that we haven't gotten to. This is a bunchberry. It's a member of the dogwood family. And you can see again, it has parallel veins, the same as that orchid did, or similar to it. And 4 petals. Are those petals, Nathan?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. Sometimes what look like petals aren't, and yeah, I wonder with the dogwood family if they are. Not sure.
Yeah.
An interesting thing on flowering plants is they evolved after non-flowering plants, and so the flowering parts, the petals and sepals, are actually, they're really modified leaves. The leaves themselves evolved into sepals and petals. And like if you look at a lotus flower, it's a really great example. You can almost see the progression of kind of leaves turning into flowering parts. So, yeah.
This is a great native plant, and you know, we're always still discovering new things about plants. And this one, not that many years ago, a graduate student was studying something else and became interested in these, and recognized that they actually launched their seed and catapulted out. And the process of that is really an incredible thing. And she ended up studying these, and it was pretty cool how it happened. So there's been some recent work on how this plant shoots out its seed from when it's fully mature, and the process that takes place. And it's pretty cool plant.
When I have a lot of these plants growing on my neighbor's property that he recently converted from forest to early successional forest. So this is a plant that had been living in a shaded environment, and then all of the trees, or almost all of them, were cut down. But it seems to be just exploding in its population in this new habitat with a short understory of shrubs, well, trees that are starting to grow. So I noticed a comment about it being seen on mountain paths, which it certainly is, but it's also fairly common in lowland elevations too. This one is
Subaldiopsis.
yes.
Trichomonas.
Yeah. What is
the three-toothed Syncophoil?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this plant is usually found in rocky balds, alpine and subalpine areas. If you zoom into the leaf, Zoe, you can see how the end of it is kind of divided into 3 teeth. So that's one way to identify it. And then if you look at the flower, it's a typical rose family flower pattern.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time. That went by really quickly. I hope you all feel the same way. Time flies when you're having fun. Does anyone have any burning questions right now? You can always email me if you think of something later, and I can get in touch, put you in touch with the people that actually have the answers. I'm kind of the liaison for that. And I will talk with the crew about potentially doing part 2 so we can finish up our list. But does anyone have any questions right now before I have to log off? Nope, looks like everyone's saying